Okay, hello everyone. This lesson is just a real focus on the key question of what caused World War II. Now, this is a really important question for you to be able to get to grips with. Often comes up on exams. It's one of the most important questions to think about. And really, generally, historically, it's a question that has been much debated by various historians through time, particularly looking at the sort of debate about how much Hitler was to blame, how much things like appeasement were to blame, how much the Treaty of Versailles was to blame. So it's a really interesting historical question, and certainly one that you can get really stuck into and really get some great debate and discussion going. So we've done this whole unit now, and this is actually the last lesson on the conflict and tension course. So we're going to look at that, and I've given you a Word document as well, just for you to have a look at and to think about some of the key factors for what caused the Second World War. So obviously, the Second World War broke out in September 1939, and this was a really big moment, obviously, in the history of the world, one of the most important and significant events in the history of the world, certainly of the 20th century. And this was something that people had tried so hard to avoid. The Treaty of Versailles had been set up to try and create a lasting peace in Europe. No matter what we think of the Treaty of Versailles, the objectives of the big three had been genuine. They did not want a repeat of a war, even though many people at the time were deeply critical of the Treaty of Versailles. Woodrow Wilson, when he had the vision for the League of Nations, had envisaged an international community coming together through diplomacy, talking through problems, and ensuring that war was avoided and didn't happen again. That had obviously failed. America had isolated itself in the 1920s and 1930s, much to the sadness really of Woodrow Wilson, who died in the 1920s. And then, things had happened that we looked at last lesson, like the Nazi-Soviet Pact, which kind of helped cause the Second World War in a more immediate, short-term type way as well. And of course, Hitler coming to power in Germany, very much really as a result of the impact of the Great Depression, was obviously a huge contributing factor to bringing about the Second World War. But obviously it's complex to think about what brought Hitler to power, and obviously some of the upset around things like the Treaty of Versailles had enabled a dictator like Hitler to be able to come to power and make the kind of promises which had been popular with some, not all of course, but with some of the German people in the 1930s. So we're going to look at why World War II broke out in 1939, and this is what we're going to think about in this lesson. This is where it ties into what we've done. We looked at the invasion of Poland last time, and we'll be doing an end of unit test as well. So we're going to look at some of those different factors. We're going to look at maybe some ideas for a practice question as well, and then you're going to think about which factor you think is the most important. So you can pause this video at various times just to have a look at bits of information in a little more detail. Use some of the resources as well that I've given you as well, just to help you out. So let's find out about what caused World War II. So really, these are the key factors for you to be aware of, and it's probably worth you, just in your notes, I don't need to see this, but just in your notes, making some kind of mind map just to help you out with this. So the first factor really to think about is, was Hitler to blame for the Second World War? So you need to be able to think about all of his aggressive actions that he took in the 1930s. Things like, for example, the reoccupation of the Rhineland, the rearmament, for example, walking out of the disarmament conference way back in 1933. Training his soldiers through the Spanish Civil War, and then obviously the immediate things that happened in 1938 and 39, like the Anschluss, the taking over Sudetenland, the Munich Agreement, the invasion of Czechoslovakia, and then of course the invasion of Poland. And you've got to ask yourself the question, if there was no Hitler, would there have been a Second World War? And that's a key question for you to think about. But then tie that in with appeasement. So did Britain and France take the right approach towards Germany in the 1930s? And this is a really complex question for you to think about, and it's been much debated by historians through time as well. So, for example, should they have stopped Hitler in 1936? Now, it would have been very difficult for them to do that. It's easy, with the benefit of hindsight, to say, well, they should have just stopped him, when they had the chance. But you've got to remember that the vast majority of people in Britain and France did not want a war in the 1930s. Britain and France were both very badly affected by the Great Depression, And it would have been very, very difficult to get public support for any kind of conflict during that time. In fact, there were very few people really in the 1930s that were calling for aggressive actions towards Germany. One of them, of course, we know was Winston Churchill, but most of the British people were behind the policy of people like Neville Chamberlain at the time. So it's really important that we don't think, well, just because war did break out and appeasement supposedly failed, that therefore it must be the most important factor. But some ideas for you to think about that. Failure of the League of Nations, particularly in its dealings with Japan, with the Manchuria crisis, with Italy, with the Abyssinian crisis, that's important to think about. The Great Depression changed the world, there's no doubt about that. It made countries focus a little bit more on their own countries and less on international cooperation. We can see countries like Britain and France doing that themselves in the 1930s. The Treaty of Versailles, going way back to 1919, was it too harsh? Did it mean that it created a Germany that was always going to want to get revenge and allow someone like Hitler to come to power there? Was it unrealistic, the Treaty of Versailles? And then the Nazi-Soviet Pact, a much more immediate cause. But obviously we know that things like the Munich Agreement in 1938 alienated Stalin, who was the leader of the Soviet Union, and caused him to look to create this alliance with Hitler, an albeit pretty temporary alliance. So you're going to use this sheet and you're going to look at some of the evidence and you're going to decide which factor they are. You can colour code that if you want, or just write the factors in place. So if you had an example question, you might get a question like, appeasement was the most important factor for causing the outbreak of World War II in September 1939. How far do you agree with this opinion? So you've got to have a balanced answer here. You've got to find evidence to agree with it, but then you've got to make a counter argument. And for this second section, you may well end up having 2 or 3 different paragraphs within your work, and then obviously as a conclusion there for you to write as well. So if you just have a look at some example answers for this, just to help you out with how you should be writing. A good way of approaching this is to think about point, evidence and analysis. So if you have a look at this example answer, you can just pause the video now and read that. This shows you an example paragraph for writing about appeasement being the most important factor. On this next slide, I've just colour-coded it so you can see what the point is, where we've included evidence, but the analysis. And it's the analysis that really represents your own thinking. And it's the analysis where you're going to pick up marks on this question. And again, evidence to disagree, you're going to make out that the actions of Hitler are a crucial cause. And then again, colour-coded, point, evidence, analysis. So you want to read that in a bit more detail, just pause the video and then you can have a read of it. When you're writing analytically, I've showed you this before, this is the extentometer. You want to try and use different phrases to show the extent to which you agree with something or how important it is. So try and use some of those phrases to help you to write analytically within your work. So you might want to just finish off by thinking about a conclusion, and you might want to think, well, what actual opinion do you most agree with? So there's different opinions here. Was it appeasement? Was it the Treaty of Versailles, the failure of the League of Nations, Hitler to blame? So you might want to have a think about which opinion you agree with. There's no right or wrong answer for this question, and really the answer is within a combination of the factors. The factors link together, and that's a crucial thing for you to think about as well. But there's no doubt this is a really interesting historical question, and certainly one that you really need to think about when you're revising the conflict and tension course. So thanks very much for listening. As usual, if you've got any questions, let me know and I'll be only too happy to help. Thank you very much. Bye bye.